So we've been in the book of Job, and if you haven't been following along, we're in chapters 38 to 41. What you really need to make sure you know is that Job has endured incredible suffering. He had suffered so much, lost all of his possessions, lost all of his family. His health was declining, that he was an inch away from death. He was covered in boils, sitting in ashes. That's where Job is. And it's from chapters 3 all the way to 37, we find it's Job and his friends are talking. And Job is lamenting. He is in agony. He is expressing himself back and forth. His friends are saying, well, God is just. So if bad things happen to you, it's because you've done bad things. If you do good things, then God will bless you. And it's back and forth, and Job rejects that premise. But Job is in agony. He wants an audience with God, but God is silent. But in chapter 31, we find that the words of Job are ended. And I express that God's silence ends where ours begins. And we come to chapter 38, and finally God breaks the silence. We find God's response in these 4 chapters. And chapter 38 begins with God speaks out of the storm. There's this moment we don't have any description of the storm, but we get this picture that it's a terrible event. It's not just some rolling into clouds, like it's a storm that God speaks out of. It's a spectacular moment where God's majesty is on full display. Now, if we're honest, we want God to speak with sunshine and roses. We want the kindness of God to come and hold our hand, give us a hug, but God speaks with his power in this moment. Now, before this happens, before chapter 38, there's a distinct line between heaven and earth. That God is up in the heavenly realms and Job is down in the earthly realms. And there's a distinct line, but we see God breaks into this world. He breaks into earth to speak. And I want to say to you today that there's a difference between explaining God and experiencing God. Up to this point, Job and his friends have spent a long time trying to explain God, and Job is getting ready to experience God. And God finally is going to answer Job's questions in his plea. He wants an audience with God, but God's answer is a revelation, not an explanation. God doesn't come and say, well, here are my 3 points so you can be put in your place. God reveals himself. That's how God answers Job's question. Job is stuck in the human thought process of reasoning. This is how we understand who God is. But God is breaking those superficial constructs, because God is not just giving Job an explanation of words and language and articulation. God is revealing himself, and that is the only true answer for suffering. So God asks Job questions. He gives Job the opportunity to speak as he's confronting Job's false choices, false conclusions, false thinking. And Job has 2 options here. Job can either remain in the world that revolves around him, which would remain in the world of misery, or he can step into God's ongoing story of recreation. God is always doing new things, and we can step into that story. And even though we may not understand it, even though it may be incredibly painful, we can step into the story where God is doing new things. So in chapter 38, it said God spoke out of the storm, but God says something specifically to Job that I think we need to hear. He tells Job, says, brace yourself like a man. Get ready. There's nothing wrong with what Job has done. Job has expressed himself completely. And we as people are emotional beings, and we need to be able to express ourselves completely. But God is getting ready to put Job in his place. I know you're going through a lot, but sit down and listen up. Brace yourself like a man as God confronts the conclusions that Job has come to. Because God is a creator. He created this world. And the more we learn about this world and this universe, honestly, the less we realize we know. Like the size and the scope. I mean, we know things that Job had no idea about. A quick Google search, and you could figure out certain things like what is the diameter of the earth? Or how many square miles is the earth? You could do that. You could probably get me an answer in 20 seconds or less. Job had no way of knowing those things. But God, he articulates that he is in control. He limits where the water goes. He sets the boundary lines for the water. So that God is in control even of the tides and how the rivers flow. And we have this image of God as a general. He is commanding his troops. That is how creation responds to God. And he commands creation daily. But again, we know way more about the world than Job did. But no human can walk the recesses of the deep. And I'm not talking about going into the deepest part of the ocean or drilling into the core of the earth or anything of that nature. I'm talking about the depths of how this world is held together. We can understand things. We might be able to document things, but God understands it so much infinitely more than we do. See, there's a difference between explaining God and experiencing God. And God is setting the scene so Job understands that Job can't understand God. He is so great. He is so big. He is so powerful. Job can't understand him, so God is revealing himself. He goes even as far to say that God controls the light, and he goes to the source of light because God is the source. So when we think of what the source of the light is, well, God is the source. And we can sit here and say, well, the source of light is the sun, and the sun is this ball of gas that is on fire, and even that explanation is pretty lacking. But God is the source of light. The sun is not our source. God is the source. And God goes as far as to talk about how he controls the weather, controls the rain, controls the snow, saves snow and hail for times of war. He talks about how ice can be used. And now water itself is an interesting element or atom, and that it has unique properties. But one thing about water is when it freezes, it does specific things for us. When it freezes over the pond, it insulates the rest of the water so the fish can survive. When it freezes in the soil, it breaks up the soil to help it to be more suitable for plants to grow. God knows all of these things. God just doesn't know these things. He created these things so they happen that way. See, it's one thing for me I create something, but God, or to know how something works, but God created it. He just didn't look at, I see how that works. Like you could open your computer or the engine of your car or something like that and see how it works. But God created it, and he knows the ins and the outs of it. He talks about the stars in the sky, and there's a difference between astronomy and astrology. Astronomy is the science of studies of the universe and the stars and the planets. Astrology is trying to predict the future based on how those things are aligned or something of that nature. But God is taking Job on a tour of the universe. That's what he does in chapter 38. And there are many things that we as humans don't perceive or witness. We may come to conclusions of how this works or how this functions, but there are mysteries in this world that we still don't know. And some of those mysteries can be with the animals. Now, we have different documentaries that have given us insights to the research of how animals function. But a lot of the things that God brings up, Job would have had no idea. And in chapters, end of 38 into 39, God brings, there's 6 beasts and 5 birds. And God asks Job, do you understand how they live? Do you understand how they function? Because most of these animals do not function as a domesticated herd. God is using these animals to display the vastness of creation and how creation functions. But again, it's not as though God just knows how it works. He created it to work that way. Talks about how the lion and the raven, how do they get food? The goat and the deer, how do they give birth? The donkey, how did the donkey become a wild donkey? How did it go free? It said the ox, how can you trust the wild ox? Brings up the ostrich, and the ostrich is a weird looking animal. Many birds have functional wings. Why did God create birds that cannot fly? Why do ostriches have eggs or nests and very vulnerable spots that seem as though they don't even care about their young? He talks about horses. Horses have strength not because of human training. And what God is doing there is he's showing the difference between human wisdom, which is wild and unpredictable and has real no purpose, and God's wisdom, which is controlled, which is clear, which has a direction and a purpose. And God talks about the hawk and the eagle, who commands them. So God brings all those animals up. And Job may know certain things. You may know certain things about these animals. But God not only knows about these animals, he created them to be this way. Chapter 40 and 41 are really interesting because God brings up 2 beasts, I guess we could say. Chapter 40, God brings up the behemoth. That's what's happening in chapter 40. But before he does that, he gives Job the opportunity to speak. God has essentially taken Job through a tour of the universe and given Job the opportunity, do you have anything to say? God knew the answer. There's nothing that Job could say that would be beneficial to the conversation. But Job puts his hand over his mouth so he would not even be tempted to speak. He prevents himself from saying something he shouldn't. And so here's what I conclude about this moment. We see that Job is not yet broken. He almost is. He realizes that he needs to continue to listen. He realizes that he is over his head. He realizes that he doesn't have all the answers, and he may not be getting an explanation, but he is getting a revelation. God is coming to him. He's not at complete repentance. He's not deep enough yet. He is silenced, but he's not yet convinced. So in chapter 40, we see that God states his power again. Now he moves to affirm his justice. Job claimed that God was unjust with how Job was allowed to be treated. So God is now challenging Job, and he does so by bringing up the behemoth. Now the behemoth is there's certain animals that it could be, or a combination. It could be the elephant, the rhino, the water buffalo. The main one scholars use to talk about the behemoth is the hippopotamus, which is a really interesting thing. The hippopotamus does not look very menacing. Now, when it opens its mouth, it looks menacing, but it just looks like an overweight animal that looks like it has no motivation in life. Maybe that's not what you get when you look at the hippopotamus. It lives in the water, but it can't swim. So I don't know what it does if it gets out too deep. But the hippopotamus is the main animal that is included in the description that God gives. But the behemoth, the word is plural for beast, or joined into one. So behemoth could be super beasts. That could be the word we use to describe the super beast. And if we think of something like the hippo would have been a terrifying animal for someone like Job to run into. Now, even today, the hippopotamus is like the most dangerous land animal in the world. Like, it kills more people than others. With modern weapons, we could hunt the hippopotamus from a relatively safe standpoint. Job didn't have that luxury. They couldn't do that back then. It was a dangerous animal that they just needed to avoid. What God is pointing out is that he controls that which nature cannot control. He controls that which humanity cannot control. Even the behemoth, God is in control over. God has no fear over the behemoth. He can come up to the behemoth and he will listen to whatever God says. Then in chapter 41, God moves on to the Leviathan. And the word Leviathan means to twist or to writhe or the folded one. The common animal we use to describe the Leviathan is the crocodile. That it has some snake and even some dragon characteristics to it. And it poses the question, what can you do with a captured crocodile? Nothing. Now, some of you may like snakes, and I struggle with snakes. I'm not a huge fan of snakes, but I struggle with why someone would want a snake as a pet. Because the only thing the snake wants to do is squeeze the life out of you. And if you like snakes, and I'm not trying to be mean or derogatory towards that, the point is that reptiles don't have relationships in the same way that mammals do. And so we're seeing this reptilian type animal being described that cannot be tamed, that it means to writhe or to twist or the folded one. The Leviathan represents the ultimate forces of wilderness and chaos in this world. It lives in the water, so we can't always see it. It can be hiding there and we don't know it's there. And so it can surprise us. It is just complete wilderness and chaos in this world. It lives in the sea, which is untamed. It's the monster of the sea. It only answers to God. The idea of the Leviathan being domesticated is laughable. It's dangerous. And the only thing we can do is avoid it. Now, the Leviathan and the behemoth are in some ways opposite parts of creation. The Leviathan lived in the sea, in the salt water. The behemoth lives in the fresh water and on land. They both represent terrifying power in creation. Now, some go as far to say that these two beasts represent the beast in Revelation 13. You may remember in Revelation 13, there's the beasts of the land and the beasts of the sea. The behemoth would be the beast of the earth, has a tail like cedar, bronze bones, limbs like iron, while the Leviathan is coiled, folded dragon of the sea, overwhelming power, intimidating size. It's a monster of monsters. So God uses both the behemoth and the Leviathan to say that even in the most dangerous, terrifying, powerful forces in this world, God is in control. Everything listens to God. There is nothing that happens without him allowing it to happen. And so we get to the central point of the book. We spent 37 chapters trying to answer the question, will Job bless God or will Job curse God? And we get to chapters 38 to 41 and we realize that's not even the central point of the book. Will Job bless God or will Job curse God? It's in the central point of the book because you know what? We never find out if Job blesses God. It never actually says if he does or if he doesn't. Because that's not the central point of the book. Job's conviction is no longer the driving point of the story because the book's not about Job. This aha moment, Job realizes it's not about me. If it's about me, then I've made myself my own God and I'm worshiping myself. It's about the Almighty God. That's what Job realizes. That's what God is communicating. It's not Job-centered, it's divine-centered, it's God-centered. The book of Job began with the driving question of whether Job's faith in God would be strong enough to withstand the tragic and even senseless events that occurred. But it ends with the question of whether Job is willing to lay aside his case against God to embrace what God is in the process of doing. God's saying, I'm in control. This may seem really, really difficult. And not only is it okay for you to express your agony, it's good for us to fully express ourselves. But at some point, you have to say, I am hurting, but my God reigns. That's what God is communicating to Job. He's not saying, ignore your suffering, pretend it doesn't exist, act like everything's okay. Because that's part of the problem we have. We, like James chapter 1, consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kind. So we have to act happy when we suffer. We don't have to act happy when we suffer. Job is never condemned for being sinful. But God is reminding Job that he is God. God is revealing himself to him, because faith in the deepest and truest sense is not about human effort or moral endurance in the midst of extreme difficulty. In the deepest sense and truest sense of faith, faith is about humanity's response to God's revelation. God's revelation, not the explanation of God. Not being able to reason everything out so it all makes sense. That's what we want, or that's what we think we want. Faith is not about my ability to reason and logically get there. Faith is about, how do I respond to God's revelation in my life? Because if we're honest, we're pretty prideful people. We think we know best. We think we've got it figured out. We think we've got all the right answers. See, Job didn't understand God more because him and his friends had these beautifully articulated speeches about God. It's not because they were able to do research and come to these awesome conclusions. Job came to know God because God revealed himself to Job. That's how Job grew. That's who he knew. He was awestruck in this moment. Job, as we look throughout the speeches, Job always believed that God was omnipotent. Omnipotent means that God is all-knowing. Job always believed that God was all-knowing. He now understands God's majesty. He understands God's might in a new and expanded way. See, the more we know God, the more we trust and understand God. It was almost as though before this happened, Job knew about God, and now Job knows God. That's kind of the transition that happens. Now, I have to say that with a bit of a caveat. In chapters 1 and 2, remember, God explains who Job is. He says there's no one like him. He is blameless. So it's not as though Job was just somebody who says, I like the idea of God. Job was fully trying to follow God his whole life. That's why he was identified as blameless by God. That's why God said there is no one like him. And yet, even though that's how God described Job, Job still had a lot of growth to do. I don't care how long you've been following Jesus. You got a lot of growth to do. That's what Job reminds us here in this moment, because the testing is re-articulated. It's not about a challenge of faith, but about a response to the revelation of God. And that can be really difficult for us. When I'm going through difficulties, for me to say, well, it's not about my faith, it's about how do I respond to God. What do I do when God doesn't show up? What do I do when it seems though God is silent? That's why we need Job chapters 3 to 37. Job expresses himself. He shares. He cries out to God. He pleads. He laments. At times he is demanding. It's okay for us to articulate what we're going through. But at some point we have to come to the same conclusion as Job in Job chapter 31 verse 40. The words of Job are ended. We have to come to a point to say, my words are ended. I've expressed myself fully, and now I need to respond to the revelation of God. Hopefully we get there quicker than later. Hopefully it's not something that just takes forever for us to get there. See, behind Job's suffering is an intense battle of the spiritual realm between heaven and hell. That's what's going on here. But the question is not, will Job bless God or will Job curse God? The question is, how does Job respond to the revelation of God? Because there's a difference between explaining God and experiencing God. God was reminding Job, Job, it's not about you. Job, you are not the center of the universe. We know that, but when we're going through stuff, it's hard to believe that. If I don't believe that it's not about me, then I'm making myself my own God and I'm worshiping myself. God invites Job to experience his majesty, to experience his power, to experience his revelation. And God wants to reveal himself more and more to us. And one of our biggest holdups is we try to make it about me instead of about God. That is how God challenges Job. Say, it's not about you. It's not about what Job will do. It's about God's power revealing himself to us.